Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carlos. I'm a web developer based in Brooklyn, New York. And today we're going to work on a project called the Quote Keeper, the server layer testing. And this is from the test-driven development course. Now, in order to complete this project, you should be familiar with Chai and Supertest libraries. We're going to be using a lot of assertions and using Supertest to run testing requests, HTTP requests. You should also be familiar with how HTTP request works. How do we send data with POST request? How do we retrieve data with GET? And know how the server level testing patterns work. We're going to be testing certain requests by retrieving some data on the server side. Also be familiar with the test-driven development implementation patterns, how to work with the red-green refactoring process. So we'll be writing some tests, making sure they fail, then writing the code to make them pass, and then refactoring that code. So let's go ahead and jump straight into the project. So for this project, we're going to be writing some server tests for an application in order to save and display a collection of quotes. This app is going to be called Quote Keeper. So at the moment, we have some feature level tests which submit a quote, a source, and who it is attributed to, and then asserts that it's displayed to the user. But some of the features for that test is not going to be able to pass, so we actually have to dive into the server level and write some tests for it to pass. So we're going to be going through the test-driven development approach to implement the corresponding server behavior. You'll be displayed with a bunch of files here. We'll be going through each of them as we go through the steps, so don't worry about them too much at the get-go. So let's go ahead and just jump straight into step one. Okay, so for step one, the scope of our test is that a user should be able to submit a quote and have it displayed back to the user upon submission. Now the feature version of this test is located in Features, User Visits Root Index. So let's go ahead and check that section out. And we have our test here, which is a feature level test. You can see how we're mimicking the UI of how the user would interact in this page. So the goal is basically we're going to be displayed a main page where there is a form that we can fill in, where they can put in a quote, an attributed part, and a source, and then submit that form. And then once we're redirected to the same landing page, the landing page should have a section that displays the quote above us. So you can see how the browser would get the text from a section that has an ID called quotes, and it will basically display the quotes that we just submitted. So we'll be working on the same page. We're not going to be redirecting ourselves to another route. It will all be in the same page. Okay, let's simply run our test to see what was failing at the moment. So let's go ahead and open a terminal and type npm test. Okay, you'll see our feature test here that's not passing. We see they're posting a quote describe block, which is this one, it's failing, and we see that an element cannot be located on the page using the given search parameters quotes. So it doesn't find any element that has this selector on it. Okay, let's move on to step two. Now we're going to start working with our server level testing. So let's go to our index test file, which is the second file on your tab here. And in case you close any of these tabs, you can actually find them if you click on this icon here on the top left. You should be able to find the files that we just displayed here. So we're going to our routes, index test, which is the one I'm on right now. Here we're going to start writing our first test. So we're going to do our describe block. First block is going to be just the page we're working on, which will be the root page. The nested describe block will be the operation we're going to be working with. So in this case, we're going to be working with post requests in the index page. And inside that, we're going to write our first unit test, which is the availability to create a new quote. So let's go ahead and create our first describe block. Describe. Actually, this is inside the function. Got to make sure I'm out of here. Here we go. Describe. We're going to work on the index page. Pass in a callback function. And inside here, we're also going to nest another describe block for our post requests. It's a little hard to type accurately and talk at the same time. Apologies for the spelling mistakes I have here. And let's run an it block, which will be empty at the moment. We'll call it creates a new quote. And we're going to pass it in the synchronous function because we're going to be working with server requests. So make sure you mark the function that we're going to pass in with async. Take no parameters, and here we go. Leave it blank for now. Okay, great. Let's move on to step 3. So for the setup, declare and assign strings to variables for quote, attributed, and source. So we're going to pass in some dummy data here to mimic how we're going to send a post request. We're going to need to actually send some information here. If you open the hint, there's some dummy data there, but you can actually type in whatever you'd like. I'm going to go ahead and just grab the quote and attributed and source from the hint here. And let me just indent this a little bit. Oh, there we go. And this one here. Okay, go ahead and save this. And we'll move on to step 4. Okay, so for the exercise, we're going to make a post request to the root page, and we're going to submit these variables we just created. We got to make sure to include .type form because we're sending it as a form into the post request. Now in this case, we already imported request from Supertest, so we can actually start working with testing requests with this actual library. Now we're going to be assigning this to a variable. I'm going to call it response, and this response object will hold the data once the post request is completed. So now that we have an asynchronous function here, we have the keyword await, which I'll explain how that works in a second. So let's start by typing our variable here called response. We're going to wait to do a post request here. We're going to send a request. We're going to wait, so we're going to wait until this is completed, and then assign the result, or the resolved promise to be specific, to our response object. And that response object will have a bunch of properties that we can call and retrieve certain content from it. So we're going to await for our request. We're going to call request, which is what we just imported here. We got to pass in a server here, which will be our Express app, and we have to find that on line 6 here. So we're going to pass in our app, and now we can actually start calling certain methods that are from the request library. We're going to send a post request to the root page. We're going to make sure that the type we send is type form, and we're also going to send the information, the variables we just created above. Make sure you wrap them in curly brackets. So I'm going to send quote, attributed, and source. Okay, great. Go ahead and save that. Now we can move to step 5. Okay, once the post request is completed here in our unit test, we can start running our assertions. So remember, our response object will contain certain properties that we can call. So let's start by our status code. One of the properties response will have is a status code. So we can call .status, and we know that the status code for when a request is valid and executed properly should be 200. So let's do assert equal. Make sure response.status as the actual value we would get will equal the expected value, which is 200. Perfect. Okay, now we're going to test that the content retrieved in the response object in the text includes these variables that we just defined above. Now in this case, we can pass in response.text, which would be basically all the HTML contained in the main index page that we would retrieve after the post request. So we could actually parse, we use this function here. We can parse all that text from the response.text object, which will be HTML as a string, and we can specify the selector we want to look into, and want to make sure that that selector, the content within that selector, includes the variables here, the strings we have in these variables. So remember back in your feature test, you can see here, we're planning on putting in a selector quotes that contains all the quotes that we have submitted after our post request. Okay, so let's go ahead and type in assert. Now we don't want equal to because we just want to make sure that the responsive text within that selector includes this content. So we'll call include. Then we can parse, we use our handy function, our helper function here. Parse text from HTML. That will take 2 elements. One would be response.text, would be the HTML as a string from the main page. And we're going to pass in a selector called quotes. And then from there, we expect the value to be the actual quote, this guy right here. Now we're only checking if the content within this selector here has this string. We will also want to check that it includes the attributed string and the source string. So I'm going to go ahead and copy paste this 2 more times and simply change this so that the content within our text in this selector also contains the attributed string and the source string. Okay, let's go ahead and save that, and then we can move on to step 6. Now I'm going to go ahead and run my test here. So we can see our request is passing. We get a status code of 200, but we still get a new error of no element with selector quotes found in the HTML string. So basically it's finding here, and it's saying we can't find an element, a selector that has this ID. There's no hashtag quotes. There's no ID with this tag in the HTML you passed. So in step 6, it says the status code assertion is passing, but the rest of the server level test is failing, just like the corresponding feature level test. So when the quote is submitted, the response does not include the submitted quote. It doesn't include it because this selector is not found in the HTML text that we're passing through. So it doesn't find this, and therefore can't pass in the expected value either. Now step 6 indicates they've added a handles bar to the project so we can work with certain JavaScript and HTML dynamically. And we can look at it right here. That should be the 3rd tab. You can see it's empty. So we can copy the information from our public index HTML into our index.h handles bars. So we have our HTML here. So let's grab this and paste it here. Now the way our server is working is that when we do our request, it's rendering. It was rendering this handlebars page, which is the index page, but since it was empty, it couldn't find a quotes selector. So now if we actually save this, it should actually find the selector quotes in the page we're actually rendering. So let's go ahead and run our test again. And now we get a different error. So now it found our selector, but our selectors does not include the quote that we passed in. You can see it's essentially empty. Okay, let's move on to step 7. Now eventually in step 7 it says we don't have a database set up yet. Eventually you'd actually implement a database to actually store this, so it will persist the data and actually store it. For now we're actually going to do it differently and work on a server level so we can actually write our server level testing. So for now, let's respond with a submitted quote to the user. So the data won't be persistent, but it will demonstrate the proper behavior. And we're eventually going to refactor this when we move to the model layer. So the code for handling the data post is in routes index, which would be right here. And within this handling for post, we need to capture the submitted data by destructuring the request body. So you can see that when we hit this post request, we're rendering our index handlebars, which is all this in here. But when we send information to this page, which would be inside the request.body object, it's not being stored anywhere. So we need to actually grab that data first from the request.body. Now I'm going to be doing this using an ES6 feature called object destructuring. I'll show you how that works in a second. So we can simply do that by extracting the variables, the properties from the rec.body object. So I'll simply pass in the variables that we're going to extract, which would be quote, attributed, and source. And we'll set that equal to rec.body. And this is simply the same as writing quote rec.body.quote. So if the body has a certain variable or value inside the request.body object, it's the same thing as doing this. So we can actually just extract it by removing that and wrapping it in curly brackets, and that simply grabs it. So we're doing that for both, for all these guys, the quote and attributed and the source. Remember, the request body will be all the information from the form that's submitted. And if you actually want to look into this a little more specific, if we submit this form, which will be a post request to this route, each input will have a name. So these names are extracted from the rec body. So when we submit something in the request body in a form through a form, the values will be recBody.attributed, recBody.source, recBody.quote. So whatever you name here will be a property in the request, in the body of your request. Okay, let's move on to step 8 now. So now we need to render the template with this data. Again, in routes index.js, pass the values to the .render method. Let's go to our index file here. Now we need to I'm going to take this line out, pass it in here. Remember, render basically exposes the template that we're going to pass in, which will be our index page, which is a handles bar page, and we can pass in values as a second parameter. So just wrap it in curly brackets and pass in the values we just grabbed from the request body. So quote, attributed, and source. Okay, save that. And then we can move on to step 9. So once these values are passed in, we can actually use them in our handlesbar file. So in step 9, use handlebars to render the quote within the quotes selector section at the top. This can be done now how you like. Our test is just checking that the test exists in this section. So we just want to expose those values in this page so that when we actually re-render this page after the post request, we can actually display those elements in our section. And remember, this is the selector that will contain all the quotes. Okay, so maybe look back in your feature test. You'll see that we have a selector quotes, and inside that text, it will contain the information that we submitted. So look back in your feature test, take a look again at your route test. We're grabbing all the information from our HTML root page, looking into the quote selector and making sure that inside that selector we have this string. We also make sure that we have the attributed string and the source string. Okay, so let's go back here. All we need to display is the values that we passed in. So quote, attributed, and source. And in order to display JavaScript elements in handlebars, we just have to wrap them in two curly brackets. So quote, I'm just going to pass it in next to each other so it's just faster and easier. Attributed, and we'll pass in source as well. Go ahead and save that. And then we can move on to step 10. So let's run our test again and see what we get. Okay, we get a passing test now. And we're able to create a new quote. Let's just see more specifically. Our test passes now. So now we're able to actually create a quote. So our test was successful in submitting the post request with our request library. We grab these variables, send that into our post request as a form. And then after that, we're back in our main page, and we make sure that we parse the HTML from the response.text object. We look into the quote selector, which is this selector here. And inside that selector, that includes this string, the attributed string, and the source. Okay, makes sense? Okay, however, it seems that we have almost exactly the same code in public index HTML as we do in our handlesbar index HTML. So we're going to do some refactoring now, which is the last section of our TDD implementation process. So let's go to our routes index.js file right over here, and let's make a new route. We're going to make a route for an empty handler for a GET request for the index page. So we can simply do that by typing router get, pass in the route we're actually hitting, pass in your callback function with the parameters of your request and response, and that's it. It'll be blank for now. Go ahead and save that, and we can move on to step 11. So let's run our test. Now we should be expecting this to fail. It will give us a timeout failure. That's because it's kind of searching for something to render in our GET request, but it doesn't find anything. It's just waiting to find something to render or to grab from to display, but it can't display anything since it's empty right now. So it might take a second, but we see we got a timeout exceeded. The execution of the test posting a quote, it took too long. So there's nothing being rendered in our GET request. So we're in step 11, our test should now be failing without a timeout since the route hasn't been implemented. See if you can implement the code to get the test into the green. So what are we rendering? All we need to render is the same page we have when we do a post request. So we just have to render our index page. I'm just going to grab this here, rest render our index page. Go ahead and save this. And let's run it one more time. Perfect, we get the same passing one. So we get 200 for a GET request, for the style sheets as well, and our post request passes as well. So perfect, that is the testing for our server side. So now that we have the passing test, step 12, we can remove our old implementation. So we can delete the contents of index.html. So let's go to index.html, and we can delete all this here. You can save it. And let's just double check and make sure our tests are all passing. So our post request is passing, and both our GET requests for the style sheets and our main root page are working. So perfect, that concludes our project here. Now be aware, this is the second layer. We have the server layer for testing, and this is very good at actually working through the feature. We had our feature testing here, and we kind of saw how we want their websites, our users to interact with the page and what we expect. But we needed to implement our server testing to ensure that our API calls and our HTTP requests were working as the expected behavior. Now, this is not completed yet because we're going to be actually implementing models for this. So we're going to go and dive into our model server, a model layer, to actually be able to persist data and store data into our application. But we saw how useful our request library from Supertest works. We can very easily make requests in our unit test by chaining methods to our request by passing in an application, which would be our express after us, and then changing methods like post request. You can do many things with a request. You don't only have to do post, you can do .get. There's many different types. I would recommend you guys take a look at their documentation if you want to explore a little bit more into what other features they have. We also have worked a lot with assert. We know the options, some other chain methods we have with assert. These are not the only ones. They have a bunch more. So take a look at the Chai library and their assertion library so you can have more dynamic testing with a lot of the stuff you can test here. But thanks for watching. That includes our project for today, and I'll see you guys next time.